We are speaking together in a way, collectively here by the text that I will read, and then at the end I will show some practice from my own practice and experience, and this way Drehli is also here. In our German language book Nonsolution on the politics of actively refusing pre-described solutions in building and planning, and we are actually working at this moment on an English rewrite, or we could say Re-Figuration. I hope it will be out in a few months. So this book, Nonsolution, we aim at a politicized concept that can inform architectural and planning practices. We connect insights from critical theory, from philosophies of agency, and from radical democratic hegemony theory for unraveling the potential of non-solution, which is a term we take from Siegfried Kracauer. Non-solution means insisting on arriving at forms without omitting their contradictions and counterforces. It means being sensitive to contingency without fetishizing ambiguity. It maintains gaps and holes in collectives, and as an action, it relies on active passivity, enters into contact with popular agency, manifesting itself where ruling distributions of power and property foresee only complacency. In politics, two basic insights are equally true. First, we can do something, make a difference. Second, we can't make any difference as long as systemic conditions remain as they are, because the general framework overwhelms and massively questions the tackling of particular problems. Both positions are true, or rather, their truth lies in their impossible co-articulation. Problems have to be and can be solved, and there can be no problems, and there can be no solutions to problems. So we have this absolute contradiction. This contradiction can be dissolved to some degree, and it arrives at some degree, namely at the possibility of partial solutions or partial foundations, if we use the language of a political theory of radical democracy and hegemony. In this context, the word for the partial nature of foundations of the social whole or of solutions is conflictual. Faced with the insight that we can solve solutions and the insight that overall conditions are overwhelming, both being true in their co-articulation, we speak of solutions that are not just logically or mathematically partial, but are also partial in a political sense, which means that they are conflictual and they stay in dispute. At the end of our book, Nonsolution, we rephrase this point along the line of the double meaning of just architecture. Just architecture. Again, both meanings are contradictory and true when they come along together. It's about practicing just architecture that is planning and building, rebuilding, that contributes to justice, at least to rendering social realities a little bit less unjust, I'm sorry. We should absolutely go for less unjust. And at the same time, we have to bear in mind that it's just architecture, meaning it's only architecture. No reason to fall into pathos about its great contributions to the betterment of unequal societies, let alone to worry too much about the identity or the fundamentals of architecture as a discipline, which amounts to dissolving the contradiction to some more or less workable degree into the notion that architecture can make some contribution to reducing unjust realities by entering into political alliances with grassroots movements, sometimes also with institutions, insofar as remains of the welfare state rather than a mere police agenda are still present in them. But we're also, of course, going into alliance with thinkers of architecture or critics that have been thinking of a critique of solutionism in architecture and design. And this is more or less the body of work that we're embedding this little book that I have here in. which is the critique of Giancarlo De Carlo in his beautiful text, Architecture's Public, where he actually reminds us that we are so very good in dealing with how we do things, how we design ever smaller apartments, while we forget to ask why, what are we doing there actually, who are we doing this, who profits, who doesn't. But also, just to remind you, we were actually, of course, referring to the wicked problems that Rittel and Weber are talking about in their dilemmas in a general theory of planning. And seeing that even within their thinking through the impossibility or the kind of ever ill-defined problems that are to be solved to become ever more political in their writing. And of course, Lucius Burckhardt, who not only wrote The Minimal Intervention, but maybe this is one of its a good reference, and also is of course a reference to the University of Kassel, where I'm at this moment teaching, to really think of the least, of the most minimal intervention in a certain situation. But really, the book takes the word of non-solution, the concept of non-solution, from Siegfried Kracauer. So an important aspect of non-solution is that it puts an emphasis on factoring in contradictions, inner tensions, as well as external conflicts. This is not a morally bad thing or a malfunction, but a matter of politics. We picked the word non-solution from the 1960s New York exile writings of Siegfried Kracauer, a trained architect who worked as a sociologist, urban diagnostic, and philosopher of history, also film theorist on the fringes of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and Jane Randall also mentioned, of course, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory as one reference of hers. Kracauer uses the word non-solution at just 3 points in his work, most significantly regarding the idea of a history book, a history of the United States, written in the mid-60s, perforated with passages running counter to its overall narrative. An understanding of history as a whole containing countercurrents and disputes. This is what Kracauer called an admirable non-solution. In his respect, he also speaks of the process of, at the same time, composing and decomposing a whole. He does so in his comparisons of history to film as modes of experiencing contingency. We won't get here into detail. However, the way in which a whole never gets rid of the whole, not just phonetically, to this we will return shortly, but the whole, das Ganze, ohne seine Lücke. Ja? Also the whole without the gap. That's actually, there's an impossibility to have the whole without the gap. But first, given this event's context, a word not mere on the issue of theory design or theory design, the word is slightly more common in the German language academia. If non-solution amounts to something like a theory or theoretical concept, then one should differentiate it from a definition label. So the way we pick up this word from Kracauer, already taking it as a concept, is not about defining certain objects or phenomena as non-solutions, but rather instituting some room for play to perform non-solutional operations, non-solutional thinking and arguing with connections and consequences in the field of practices. And also we are referencing the concept of acting in Hannah Arendt's sense. Also in our non-solution book, we proceed by using non-solution in certain politicized situations, perhaps constellations, in which the focus of that concept becomes poignant, for instance, given neoliberalism's aversions to laws and clearly stated positions or plans. And we connect our non-solution arguments to other conceptual projects, knowing that, of course, we are not reinventing the wheel of politicized architecture and design. Comparable arguments have been made in other discursive contexts, that is in difference philosophy and deconstruction, critical theory and post-Marxism, and in theories of action and of radical democracy on which we are drawing a bit here. Sticking closer to Kracauer's works, we can say that non-solution is even more of a concept, not a label, since its strain runs through several of Kracauer's writings, although he uses different terminology and context of reference there. This goes on the one hand for his non-solutional politics of the last but one, which Drehli Robnik's next book is about, and which highlights the anteroom or waiting room as spatio-temporal concepts. Waiting as a form of maintaining contact in separation, vis-à-vis ultimate truth in politics. Pertaining more to our current topic of designing, planning, and rebuilding is Kracauer's conception in writings circa 1930 of the masses. He voices, so we're talking about really like the 1930s, like 100 years ago, but a very comparable time. He voices also in day-to-day newspaper politics solidarity with collectivist egalitarian political projects, that is, with the political parties of the also then divided left. But his is a critical solidarity, going along what he calls in mourning, as he writes, mourning over the high degree of that time's uniformization, Uniformisierung, in the trade unions movement, for instance, let alone in social democratic and communist forms of organizing, and fetishizing the industrial proletariat, its masculinistic unity. It's also uniformization in architecture, as if we think of high modernism at the time. He supports egalitarian politics and institutions, but worries how they make a virtue out of the necessity of standardization, which is imposed by working conditions, but also by architecture then. And in this context, the mass is, in Kracauer's approach, very different from the bashing of masses as stupid, undifferentiated, etc., in bourgeois discourses. Rather, it's an agent of non-solution. The mass is that in which the gap, die Lücke, must not be missing. It is only complete as a whole if it includes a whole. Wieder, es ist nur das Ganze, wenn es die Lücke inkludiert. The gap is what keeps collectives from self-identity and full closure. It can be eradicated, even violently, in a uniformed group or an ethnicized folk. And it can also be preserved, made meaningful and effective within the horizon of the mass as that aspect of society where the latter appears in non-solution, maybe as people out of place or as people not yet here. This would be two connecting points already in orientation of the more practical part of this presentation. First, about massness. Today we are confronted less with uniformed collectives than with folk as neo-fascist ethnos superseding the demos, but also with the uniform of individualism. The general norm that wants us each of us to be hyper-performing, self-optimizing, rationally, advantage-seeking market participants. Our approach via massness here points towards an issue related with, for instance, housing solutions. We'll talk about this later. Or think of, for instance, building groups, like Baugruppen. The general phenomenon of small upper-middle-class collectives with financial and educational capital realizing their dream homes, while there could also be the less general phenomenon of politicized building groups who keep themselves in non-solution, in a state of self-thwarted, self-complicating non-identity. I'll talk about this more in a moment. And second, just to clarify, non-solution does not prefer complex over simple solutions. A solution's downside is not its simplicity. Some solutions that are publicly labeled as too simplistic are sometimes quite racist, or they could actually, as they put the problem on minorities, on the weaker, if we think of Stadtbild discussion lately. Yeah, we're having a very simplistic, simplified solution there for something that is, so we're just saying, like, we're not critiquing simplicity, but we're critiquing exactly using, again, that critique with becoming, with actually turning onto the weaker. Rather than playing the game of rubbing complex against simple, we maintain that solutions are impossible, yet unavoidable. And this is what non-solution is about: orientation towards conflict to be acted out. To be more dense, we also rephrased non-solution as a solution with a non. It only comes with its negation, opposing the ideology according to which problems are challenged, challenges, opportunities, for whom and to whose detriment, actually. And we are opposing the current solutionism that is so happy to take the masculinist doer's pose, or in our topic, to proclaim build, build, build as panacea. If we think of Bauturbo, I don't know, for all the Germans in the room and German architects, this is where we're absolutely confronted with a very simplistic, simplified solutionism. And finally, we also talk in this book of solution with a non, but then we put together the a and the non, and it comes to the word anon, which actually is an old word, anon, being an old word for soon, and also short for anonymous. This highlights a temporal logic of non-solution, namely the delay. A present partial solution acts as a buying of time for a later, more encompassing, more radical solution, and it works toward improving future conditions for more encompassing, again, radical solutions, but also for parts of societies which are always incomplete, not least as it omits those nameless, anonymous people who aren't there yet, generationally, spatially. More radical because what counts about the reform struggle is not the demand fulfilled, but a popular subject of demand taking shape, becoming articulate and active. This is the moment where I would like to turn to some projects to kind of make it more feasible or graspable, maybe. And as you have already seen on this book, you see an image here that is actually based on this project of ours, very early art in architecture project, where I was invited as an architect to with very little money, actually, to do something, Kunst am Bau, art in architecture, in a prison. So first of all, I think we'd all ask ourselves, would we do anything in a prison? Would we not rather want to actually abolish prisons, which of course a lot of my activist friends are rather working for? And then what could you do there, which is not cynical, which is not purely aesthetic, which is not ridiculous, which is not, so you're actually getting into real acting dilemma. And while we were there, we actually, I asked, but what is this space? You can see here the construction that made this outdoor space even smaller. And I said, well, that's the garden, the outdoor space for men being incarcerated here for up to 6 months. And I asked, but where do they play football? Or where do they actually have real space outside? And they said, well, there's not really much space. And as you can see, and anyway, they don't like football. So basically you have a self-fulfilling argument here. So this is actually, we realized it's very little space, but we said, okay, we'll still do a football field, even though it doesn't fit. And this football field is a real bambini football size. It's the smallest size that there ever is, and this wouldn't even fit. So we had to fold it up and wrinkle it where you see the new construction actually came into place. So at the end, what we did, we realized with the best quality material we could find and with the best drawings, detail, a kind of multifunctional, multi-sports football field, which however has deficiencies. And now you could say, what happened here? How stupid was the architect who actually designed and delivered and got delivered a field too big to be folded up? Or you could ask, who is miscalculating here? It is obviously, is it me as an architect, or is it society miscalculating space given to people who are already kind of in the most minoritarian problematic situation? And this image has become this image of And it's also not even a very clear one, because some people thought it's trying to overcome borders or walls. But it is one that I can use and that can be used to discuss about the question of justice when it comes distribution of space, and really within the most precarious conditions. So maybe it is still a somehow bettering of the situation, yet it also inscribes, maybe here in the most, let's say, aestheticized way, which could also be critiqued, but it inscribes this logic that I did not really tackle at all, that there wasn't enough space. All I could do is deal within the much too tight space. And maybe, I'll come to other projects in this moment, but maybe this is one aspect that we can take along, to actually not to celebrate ourselves for just such a creative, beautiful, whatever intervention, but rather to critique the fact that we are too weak. I was also too weak to actually then, of course, I am as a person too weak, but we as a society and as architects are still too weak to really question how much space would actually be adequate or decent in a certain condition. In fact, it was the project that I'm taking this photo here. Behind me are the people who just played football. It was the only project where I came back as an architect, and the people who I was constantly fighting with to really get this project through, because why spend money and quality and so on these people, ran to me and said, like, we were so right. This place is already so vandalized. We shouldn't have even built it. And I was like, what happened? And he said, like, well, look at this. And I came in. It was another moment. And there was cigarette butts and stuff all around. And then I asked, but where's the trash bin? And we had forgotten to put a trash bin and a cigarette. So in fact, usually the architect is always wrong, is always the bad guy. In this case, it was meant to not work out. So basically, it was our mistake. We started to actually add extra infrastructure and made that kind of reverse that effect. Well, so in a way, I don't know, could we call this a solution as a dissensus? Could we call it something like that we would, like, how do you deal with a dilemma that you would actually, you do not want to beautify or like kind of in peace, but could you improve and protest at the same time? Could you show the miscount and maybe the miscount objecting to the count or on the count that is actually in the field? So who is counting, what is counted, how do we measure space, and who is measuring? Who is saying that something is enough and or the space would not be enough? I spoke about, I'm going just kind of jumping a bit back and forth here. I spoke about the panacea build, build, build that we're just seeing kind of with regards to the housing crisis that is so enormous, and that actually the European community put it on its agenda. And I was supposed to stay here until Monday to a conference where I talk about really how to get the Bauturbo right, while honestly, I don't believe at all in the Bauturbo. And so this is why at the University of Kassel, we just dedicate our whole teaching at this moment to umbauen, 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 to basically give the same rhythm and saying, okay, well, with build, 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 and this is really beautiful. We refer to Lucius Burkhardt in this book, where he says the prescribed solution in architecture is always to build. It's basically already inscribed in the competitions, in the logics of any project is to build. So basically, to not to build or even to kind of rebuild or refurbish is already a kind of a contradiction, or like really going against the prescribed solution. And it's referring back to what I just read about how to keep a solution open when the solution isn't there for everyone. I really appreciate, and I'm very lucky as an architect that I can work now with the second Mietshäuser-Syndikatsprojekt also in Austria, which is called Habitat there. And of this project, which I've been working on in my office for 5 years, it's actually refurbishing, it's umbauen, it's actually rebuilding a whole site, keeping as much as possible, and so on. But what I like the most is this sketch. And this sketch is actually a sketch that translates the logic of Mietshäuser-Syndikat into the logic of this building, saying that this is a Baugruppe, a building group of people who not only has no money, but takes it all by kind of direct loans. I don't know if anybody knows this concept of Mietshäuser-Syndikat, but also this logic of the constellation inscribes the impossibility later to speculate with what you build. And by actually putting your project in a syndicate structure with the syndicate, which is basically, in this case, has inscribed the impossibility, or like the Gemeinnützigkeitsstruktur, the impossibility to ever kind of, for these houses to be sold or speculated with. What does that do? It basically actually, A, says, housing crisis is not solved only because my housing crisis is solved. Yeah? So again, we can solve maybe our own housing issue situation, but how can we inscribe a bigger political context and continue to work for other people's housing situation to also kind of being tackled? But also, how do I prevent myself from, we're all not, we don't know how we act in 20 years if we don't want to kind of make money from whatever we have done as an activist so basically to really kind of or to embed in what we do kind of the possible contradictions, even the self-contradictions that we may face in our own future, and make sure that we have some sensibility to that. Also when it comes to, again, build for whom, and so on. This is a rebuilding of a building. It's the second Mietshäuser-Syndikat that we're just working on in Vienna, which is amazing because it's basically a group, we're working with Afro Rainbow Austria, who is not even designing for themselves, but they are actually working in their all after hours weekends on designing a building for people yet to come, for actually queer African people who are the weakest on the housing situation in Vienna. And this is very powerful, again, this kind of not just solving your own situation, but seeing how powerful it is to solving bigger issues while doing, so to say, what you can in a small case. I want to show you a project that is most literal in kind of unfolding a dilemma, which was a competition that I won together with the artist Eduard Freudmann for a memorial commemorating Poles who rescued Jews during Nazism and during the Second World War. And we called the project actually at the end, the monument is a dilemma, or even fivefold, and I will show you why. We were asked to do this memorial, or to design this memorial next to this Polin Museum, which is a new built museum on the history of Jewish existence in Poland, in the middle of the former ghetto. And the memorial should be just next by. And it was actually donated by a survivor who was rescued by a Pole. So we actually planned, in the first phase of the competition, to collectively, with people in Warsaw, to build and plant a whole big forest. So we called actually, the first phase was called The Monument is a Forest, collectively built, referring to also, of course, Yad Vashem, a lot of kind of questions of how to commemorate also in Jewish culture. When we realized that we were in the middle of a big conflict because worldwide Jewish community was discussing to have this memorial, yes, but not on this site, because actually it's the site of commemorating the atrocities against Jews in the ghetto, and not to celebrate Poles, the few Poles who actually, Polish people who actually helped. So we realized, okay, we're in a completely wrong situation, but the memorial had to be quickly done. The donator was already 94 years old. So we actually split in a second phase. We were only 5 people, 5 teams left. We split the projects in 5 pieces. We said the monument is a dilemma. It is a dilemma because it should be delivered fast. This is a site, but it's a wrong site. How can we deal with it? So we said, actually, we're not going to plant a forest, but we're going to plant on this site a forest nursery, young trees that can grow. It's much smaller. The monument can be opened right away. And then we designed the process. We said, while these trees are growing and growing denser, actually, this is the time of deciding where should this memorial be. To actually really embed, so to say, the process of unfolding the dilemma or getting out of the dilemma into the project. And then saying, okay, well, now it continues. The monument could become a forest or single trees or something, but it may also be a failure. It could be that in this process time, there can be no solution, there can be no consensus, which would actually mean that the memorial implodes because the trees cannot continue to grow, it gets too dense. So at the end, it may be a failure, or it may be a forest, or it may be separate trees, somewhere in whole Poland. We won the competition, unbelievably, but it didn't get realized because we didn't really comply with what the memorial looks like. But it was a very powerful, very strong international discourse about how you unfold and get out, or even don't get out of the dilemma, but how do you still act while being there? We could have also just said we give up because we certainly wouldn't have wanted to actually explicitly become part of the decision and freezing moment of the site on this spot. So in a way, non-solutional thinking is also thinking in incomplete solutions or in keeping an openness for future change. In a very, very different way, but very admirable just as much, is Hermann Czech's project of a housing complex in Vienna. Hermann Czech is maybe an architect you still know, is like still very active in Vienna. And he, already in the late 80s, 90s, he designed this complex where the clients and the people moving in wanted small windows. But he said, well, it could be that in the future, people want to make these windows larger, or maybe there's more money, or more other ideas. So not only do we, obviously as good architects structurally do that, hopefully, but he really shows it in the facade. The facade kind of prefigures a possible other future that could be much more easily kind of maybe turned into, since we're constantly also reminded, no? That the windows have a flexibility in its size and a very easiness of being turned into something else. On a more political level, I've really found, and Silvia Federici was already mentioned by Jane, it's like we were talking about how can you engage in a political struggle, yet again facing the issue of, let's say, them kind of feminist movement in New York in the 70s fighting for wages for housework. But if you only fight for wages for housework, it's nice. People who do women who do housework will have wages, but we have solved nothing else. So to actually, in a parallel sense, or basically in the same step, going for wages against housework, understanding the fight for wages for housework only in terms of bettering the conditions, starting denaturalizing the fact that it's women doing unpaid work, but actually in this sense, preparing the conditions to question this way of work separation in total is a very powerful, I think, move that was done by Silvia Federici and this group in parallel to say, okay, well, sometimes we do have to work for a reform while we want a revolution in very simplified terms now. But we need these steps actually, and something what we called we didn't call it, but we're referring to that in this book, André Gortz's concept of non-reformist reforms. How can you, within reformist steps, actually, again, implicate, inscribe the non-reformist notion of it? The one that actually still steers for larger, for further, knowing that what you do is not yet what really kind of wants to be achieved, but is a step. And how can this step actually go into the right direction? And of course, in a very, again, architectural sense, I'm giving you the field of references that we're kind of covering here in this little booklet, is non-solution as really literally the solution of not to do the prescribed thing, of not to build. And Lacan Vassals plus Leo Koch is of course a very good example of that, to say, okay, well, we are delivering a project that does not kind of change the material of it, but changes the kind of spirit of it, of kind of saying we need maintenance rather than the new design of a place. So I think that we have a lot of very good references also within architecture and design when it comes to a different way of thinking than solutionism. And that's what we are kind of proposing or wanted to put into discussion, a non-solutional thinking. So what do actually Lakatos Basile or these projects do? They are not fulfilling the brief. So the not to build is kind of also, of course, a critique of solutionism as growth within kind of a constant logic of growth. And that brings me to the last and final short moment, and then we'll open to discussion, which is also an earlier project of ours. And this is where actually my work on reflecting what we do as architects and designers actually started. It's what we then called already a non-building plan for public space. And it was within the context of winning a competition for guidelines, urban guidelines for the Viennese Danube Channel, very important waterfront edge in Vienna, right in the center. And the city of Vienna wanted actually guidelines how to deal with the enormous amount of investors' quests to build some restaurants down there. And they said, like, well, could architects actually tell us if that should be, and now I'm simplifying, blue or green, wood or steel? Could we have a corporate identity for the development? And we won, supposedly, I think, a very good jury by saying, well, we do not need the answer in what quality or aesthetics or what material do you want to build a lot of gastronomy and by that monopolizing this important space down there. But we need actually a more structural question of like, what do we need? How? Not so much how, but what, in what kind of rhythm, why, and where is the public still in there in terms of really non-commercial, non-commodified spaces. And you can see here, this was a moment where at the edges, there was still really clinging on the history of this space. And especially in the center, we saw these restaurants, and I found this the most kind of iconic diagrammatic thing of seeing how this gastronomy is always moved towards the water, reducing the space of the public ever more. So you really see the battle for public space like one-to-one played out. And this is where we had a threefold, and I'm just showing you two instruments that we did there. First, we proposed a party tour saying, well, some of why you're giving in to the commercialization is because the city of Vienna also saw it as an easy and cheap way to bring down infrastructure. So if it was, and literally, very literally, it was said, oh, we need toilets down there, we're asking a restaurant to be built, to have people find a toilet. So basically what we said is we need public infrastructure in a certain rhythm to be delivered, to not be dependent on the commercialization, commodification of public space, to also deliver very basic infrastructures. But then we also said, but what we also need is really a proactive urban tool, which is similar to what we call building plans, Bebauungspläne in German, in Austria. So rather than, or like not rather, but in addition to what we have in terms of building plans, regulating in red on white paper the possibilities what you can build on plots, to actually design a non-building plan, to do this kind of with the same authority and with the same kind of importance, to define exactly where not to build and where to keep public space properly non-built, open for future change. And within that, and you can see we even squatted the language of saying, okay, we took all the abbreviations and so on to give it the same kind of quality in space and played a little bit with that. And so we designed a whole like it's really quite long, this stretch of area that we actually designed. So this is only one part of 20, where we in 1 to 500 designed in red, yes, I'm nearly done, in red lines to keep all the edges free. Argument totally redundant, it seems, but it needed to be written down, like really as a plan on paper, to say, okay, whenever somebody comes to negotiate, there is already a prefigured, a pre-inscribed notion that lies in the city saying, no, the edge goes to the public. Sorry, guys. All the edge goes to the public of the water. We will not build it, and so on. So very seemingly redundant facts, or not even facts, redundant claims of the public to be put on paper and into plans to be there. In fact, we had a lot of spaces that were red, meaning you cannot build there. It should be preserved for the public. And so was an area which was still claimed. Actually, I should just tell you the story. So we handed in this plan. We were not allowed to call it non-building plan, Nichtbebauungsplan, because it was too aggressively negative. So we called it Rahmenplanung öffentlicher Raum, but everybody knows it as Nichtbebauungsplan in Vienna. And while this was happily taken by the city of Vienna, and I'm speaking now in a generalized way because also within administration, you find a lot of great people. We just need to really support them. And we had one project representative who was all in favor of our project, but then again, it wasn't quite at this moment part of the political goal. So it was taken into the shelf and was meant to disappear. Until in this site, in exactly that site, the last one, Sunny and so on, a restaurant came with this great idea saying, well, it's nothing there. You see there's nothing there. That's also the argument that is very often kind of claimed, this kind of neo-colonial condition of like, we always see nothingness. And this is a perfect place for a restaurant with 800 people, and of course the local politicians supported it. And this is when actually an initiative had a sit-in, squatted the place, and started to remind the city of Vienna of this non-building plan, which was just in a shelf. Honestly, we weren't even allowed to publish it then. So a lot of people sent us very serious letters asking for it. We sent it further and finally kind of created enough pressure for the plan to be publicized and actually public open. This initiative managed to secure the space that is still not kind of finished, this battle. The battle is now for the water, in fact, but 10 years later, finally, actually, I just had a talk with the city of government officials of Vienna. They've read the plan 10 years later and now see it differently and turn some of the area into really non-commercialized space. This is where I want to end. I wanted to end with really kind of the dilemmas and the conditions, questions of how we act as architects, as designers, as planners, and so on, within conditions that are not always just, never actually, just the ones that we would like to work in, but how can we act nevertheless? And that is what basically we wanted to contribute to, a non-solutional thinking that still believes in solutions, but really with a certain decensual approach. Thank you.